psychology and what happens behind the surface. So basically the structure of the talk is that I first want to walk you through how do people, and humans especially, actually make their decisions, right? What exactly happens behind the surface here? And then later, once we have looked at this, what happens in a sales conversation or a conversation in general, actually in the brain, we can look at specific tricks, what we could do to optimize the flow of these conversations. But basically, first we will do some very science-based part of the talk, and then later the application. And at the end, we will also do a little Kahoot to see who should have become a cognitive scientist of you. Exactly. So let us jump right in. For the sake of this presentation, it's very important that I understand sales, the whole process of sales, like pitching, customer treatment and everything. It's a decision-making process that is mutually influenced by two or more parties, right? Maybe one party has solution X in mind when they go in the first meeting, one party has solution Y in mind, but in the end, you end up with something completely different. And this process is, of course, a decision-making process which finds itself within different boundaries, something like budget constraints or time constraints and stuff like that. So on a very fundamental level, this is basically what human decision-making looks like, right? So you have this core of learning about the world, because without learning about information, we cannot really make proper decisions. I will go into this later more in depth, but basically it's a loop of learning, expectations, and prediction errors. Prediction errors are just the difference of what you thought the world would be like and what is de facto the case. And of course, all these different learning mechanisms, they're not happening in a nutshell. They're happening within our personality. And so you have different factors that influence this, right? Like biological aspects, like something like what's the temper of a person, right? Which is a very biology-based thing. Then you have the environment and the culture where someone grows up. You have the social groups and your peers and parents that shaped you. You have economic values and social and moral values. And you have your daily emotions, which can be influenced by things like whether you ate breakfast or not. So human decision-making is a very complex thing, of course, but there's still, we can still see some trends that are true across most people that I would like to share with you and that you can use to better understand maybe why a customer said certain things or didn't agree with certain things. Let's start with personality. I find this picture on the right very beautiful because it really shows the colorfulness of personality and how diverse each of us actually is, right? However, personality can also be seen as a consistent pattern of thoughts, feelings, motivations, and behaviors that make a person the set person, right? That differentiate different people. And whereas we like to think that everyone is like extremely individual, we actually find that personality is rather consistent across the lifetime. So you have a 0.4 correlation here between personality measured as a child and personality measured as an elder person. So you stay to some degree a very similar person throughout all your lifetime. And what is also very interesting is that personality psychology has found that there are 5 factors especially which really help to differentiate people in the way that they behave and they think about the world. And that this is actually, despite them being very individual, this is actually really helpful to have an access to some sort of types of people, which of course require different communication. So the 5 factors here are, for example, openness to new experience, right? Different people have different openness, degree of openness to how likely they are to try out a new hobby, how likely they are to go travel, how likely they are to step out of their comfort zone. Conscientiousness is more about how disciplined someone is, how likely is someone to really stick to what they're doing, how likely is someone to actually clean their room, and how likely is someone to really dive deep in data, these kind of things. Extraversion versus introversion is really about the social aspects, how likely is someone to just walk up to someone and talk to them and get to know them, right? Agreeableness is more about social togetherness, like how likely is someone to integrate well in a group and how likely are they to be more of a lone wolf type. And neuroticism was priorly called emotional stability. It's not necessarily the neurotic type that we usually think of, like people losing their control over emotions, but it's more about how, like if you meet a person at 3 different days, how different are they feeling emotion-wise, or the more like very balanced people. And these 5 factors, it's very interesting to understand people through these 5 lenses. It's of course not doing justice to how complex people are, but it's very helpful because, for example, if you know that someone is very open to new experience, but also to some degree emotionally not very consistent, right? You maybe have to think about preparing a pitch that appeals to different emotions and that tackles it from different angles. Whereas if someone is very conscientious and data focused and is very consistent in how they feel emotions, right, at least from what you can tell, you can maybe do a more numbers driven pitch. So I think it really helps if you have the time to really understand also your customers from a personality perspective. That brings us to another very important topic, social trust, right? I think humans are very fascinating animals because at the same time, we live in very individualistic cultures, right? Where we try to, well, at least in the West, where we really try to, you know, have our social media profiles and all these likes and really try to push our ego with Instagram videos. But on the other side, right, we really need this social context. But the social context is a very tricky thing because you actually never really know who you can trust and who you can't. And very fascinatingly, what neuroscience has shown is that when you are thinking about whether you want to give money to a beggar or not, the exact same neural areas are activated, like when you are in a sales pitch and thinking, and if the customer is thinking whether they should trust your words and trust your product or not. So these are actually almost the exact same things that are happening here, which I find extremely interesting, that there's basically a centralized area in the brain for processing trust and whether we want to align ourselves with someone. So what can we say about social behavior of people? Of course, you see the cute apes here. Evolutionary theory is a very strong theory in psychology today. It explains a lot of areas. You have to be careful to not over-explain things with evolution. So you shouldn't just take any random behavior people do and try to find an evolutionary explanation for it. But it can be very helpful as a rough guidance to understand certain behavior of people, especially on the group level. So first of all, maybe the brain is layered in different. The brain consists of different layers of complexity of information processing, which brings some people to make the metaphor that the brain works like machine learning models, right? Which is a whole different talk and topic. But basically, very interestingly, the cortex is the outer region of the brain, and more than 50% of this entire outer region is dedicated to visual perception, and the visual perception of human faces and social cues have even dedicated independent areas, so large chunks of the brain, which are just focused on faces and social cues like body language and so forth. So this really shows us how important from a biological perspective visual and social factors are. And for example, and what I really hope here is that as I walk you through this science, that you can make connections with what you learned about sales, right? For example, we know that visual pictures have much more power than text slides. If you ever needed to prove a scientific one, here you have it now, right? And also we know that social cues and faces in messages work very well. Here again, why is that? Because we have entire huge brain regions dedicated to processing this. So naturally, our attention will be much more drawn to these things other than just plain text on a white background. Game theory and trust dilemma, what I mentioned before, just we're not going into this, just game theory is a lot about if I cooperate with you and you cooperate with me, we both win. But if I cooperate and you don't, then I'm the idiot and you win, right? So it's a lot about these trust dilemmas. And subconsciously, this always plays a role, right? For example, if you just present, you have to understand, if you present data to your customers, they actually cannot fact check us. So you just present them slides. They can do internal checks, but at the end of the day, right, we just present them stuff and tell them this is true, you have to believe us, right? And this actually, from an evolutionary perspective, is a very tricky thing because they have to give us blind trust, right? And so things like being professional, making sure your data is accurate and there's no mistake in it, making sure you don't lie and what you say, or you don't unintentionally lie, like just whatever you say is really true. Sympathy, like being nice to each other and smiling, like having these kind of cues that we use to signal trust, they're really important in building a relationship. And just some evolutionary heuristics where we can see that we still have these kind of leftovers, and I think these are also very interesting for applying in sales. There's groupthink. Groupthink means that if you have a group of people who are like-minded, they are very likely to focus on one solution and then keep pushing for this solution because they don't want to threaten the social identity of the entire group. Very important to be aware of these dynamics, both when we do a deal room, so we don't push in one direction. So we really need also maybe someone who's a challenger and really goes against the mainstream as a advocatus diaboli, for example. Or when you have a customer and you are there and the customer has a certain idea and you don't want to challenge them, so you all go in the same way, and then in the end you create suboptimal results for the customer, right? And that's not what we want. We respect the user, so it's very important to resist this natural tendency we have to go along with the mainstream and challenge when you think the data says otherwise. Just checking the time quickly. Okay, reciprocity and consistency, very simple. If people are do something nice to someone, they have this urge inside to repay it. So if you in your first meeting with a sales meeting, you really present high value inputs without really asking for much in return, that will give a very strong feeling on the salesperson, like, okay, they gave us all of this, maybe we should give something back. Authority and social proof, very important. Humans are also hierarchical animals, right? Humans have an intrinsic tendency to think about hierarchies and group structures in terms of power relations. So it's also very important to understand the authority you have when you go in a call, right? They see you as an embodiment of Google. They see you as someone representing a very strong brand. And this authority kind of gains you this trust that you had before. Of course, your personal sympathy, your knowledge and everything is also very important, but this authority that we have because of the Google brand is a social proof that people use as a heuristic to trust us. And so it's also very important to live up to this reputation without trying to pressure people now or make them feel stressed out, but it's very important to keep a standard, an expectation that it is in people's minds, because of these prediction errors that I will later go into. And lastly, familiarity and mere exposure. Mere exposure is a very funny phenomenon. If people just see something over and over again, they like it more. That's how marketing basically works. And that's also how you can structure your sales pitch. The good thing is, unless something goes wrong in the relation, but the more often people see you, the more they will like you just by nature, right? And the more often they will hear about display or something, the more they will like it, which could lead to a scenario also where they maybe prefer display, but actually another solution will be better for them, but they feel biased just because they heard the term more often. So now let's go into this learning loop in here. So to bring you some neuroscience into this, basically the brain works fundamentally by sending neurotransmitters around the brain in different areas, right? Through these different layers that I mentioned. So you perceive an object, let's say I perceive my door, right? My expectation is the door is open, right? Then comes an action. So I press the handle on the door and the door is locked, right? And now my perception and my thoughts and my world model basically of the world and my physical experience, they don't match. And this is a prediction error. And then we have in the top right, you see a dopamine here. So then basically you have dopamine loops, which allow you to update your world model and make it fitting with reality. So you say, okay, therefore the door is locked, I should open it. And this is a very simple example. But if you think about something like a sales pitch, right? If someone expected in their world model a certain pitch and you provide them something else, there's a huge prediction error. And the very funny thing is that to prediction errors, again, tied to personality, there's actually two reactions. Either you feel positive surprise, right? Which is like, oh, cool, I learned something new. For example, you go in a movie, you expect the movie to be bad, the movie is good, you feel positive, right? And there's, of course, also negative prediction errors, which actually, and that's a very sad truth about the human brain, weigh much more than the positive. So the human brain by nature, and also for evolutionary reasons, is more made to feel negative things and see negative things than positive things, simply because back in our ape brains, it was very important for us to survive. And when there's a tiger, it's better to feel fear than to feel that it's cute or something. So because of these survival-related tasks, we have a prioritization in our brain for the negative, which means even if you have a really great pitch, don't get too self-confident because the negative will still stick in the memory, which is, yeah, a sad truth of humanity, which also explains the high number of depression, of course, that people are struggling with across the globe. I'm just going to skip this due to time reasons. It's basically the same, just a bit neuroscience for you. So what does this mean? Let's go back from the abstract science to the real world, right? That basically means that our brain works with world models, right? We have certain reference points by which we create standards. Like, for example, what is the standard I have for a good relationship? What is the standard I have for a good food, right? So you create these reference points, and people really need these. People really like to have their model and compare it with these reference points, which, to make it more salesy, is why benchmarking and peer comparison groups are incredibly important. You will not see any customer who doesn't like these competitive insights where they have a clear benchmarking with their competitors, simply because now the uncertainty is reduced because the benchmark gives them an artificial standard to which they can compare themselves. And because we saw in the neuroscience slide just now, people have this intrinsic functionality of the brain where we constantly, like every second of the day, every millisecond of the day, we compare our world models to the physical data we see and the internal data, like our feelings, and then we try to update our models, which then guide our behavior. Benchmarking hijacks this project and this process and is really helpful. And just this little robot on the side there is from Lanillos, who's a good Italian friend of mine. They made a really cool study where they basically wanted to prove that the brain really works like this. So they programmed the robot based on these models, and the robot showed very human-like behavior. So that's a very nice study, I think, to a further proof on top of 100 other publications that our brain really is working like this. So I was talking about uncertainty just now and how it's very important for our brain to reduce uncertainty wherever we can, right? So basically a prediction error is nothing else than an attempt to reduce uncertainty. So let's make this less abstract. You go into your customers goes into a sales talk with you, right? Your customer doesn't know which Google solution is the optimal one. What should they purchase? They're not sure. Can we really trust you guys, right? So they have this uncertainty, and they have a pre-configured world model, and they enter the call with these two. And then you provide the physical data, you provide the social data that helps them update their world model and reduces uncertainty, right? Because people have a really strong drive for reducing uncertainty. Again, evolutionary preference, which I explained. We want to have very predictable environments. And the fascinating thing here is that people, if they can trade off, most people, again, linked to personality, but roughly 2/3 of people, if they are faced with not knowing something or having an improper explanation that they then justify for themselves and they tell themselves it's true, right? They prefer the second one, right? And when we talk about people here, be very mindful, this is all of us. Like really also reflect yourself, where sometimes in your life you might have an uncertain situation, and rather than really thinking it through, you're just using a proxy explanation and then tell yourself, yeah, that's probably going to be right, right? And that's a very natural tendency as well, which for us in the sales org is very important to understand that people will not give you much time to build their impression of you. They have this urge to reduce uncertainty quickly with their prediction error models, right? And the best thing is, of course, if their expectations, their predictions match exactly what you present. And this brings me back to the personality topic, right? Where it's really worth understanding what the person would like to see, understanding what they're working on, researching the business, so your pitch really aligns with their expectations and there are no prediction errors. So they will perceive you as a predictable, certain agent in their social group, and therefore you build trust. So you see, I'm talking about very everyday things like trusting and expectations and pitching, but I just want you to understand what happens in the brain, which calculations happen in the brain while we do that. Going on, I have 10 minutes left, perfect. Ambiguity versus risk, very interesting. Broad body of studies on uncertainty showed that there are two different types of uncertainty, which, and this is the crazy thing, are represented by different neural systems. So we have two different systems and connections in our brain that handle uncertainty differently based on whether it's fully ambiguous, which means something like I ask you, oh yeah, do you think in 1.5 years we will have the first person on Mars, right? Versus risk. Risk means, oh yeah, 70% chance it's going to rain tomorrow. I want to do my party tomorrow. Is it worth the risk, yes or no? So risk is when you have numbers that capture the uncertainty. Ambiguity is if you don't have such a proxy, if you're really like totally lost what's going to happen, right? And this is totally different in the brain. And this is fascinating because ambiguity is more emotional. If you have no numbers to guide your thinking, you're becoming more emotional. You're becoming more instinctive and intuitive, and you interpret more, right? And that's, again, and usually people react more radical to ambiguity than to risk. And people try to put numbers, even artificially, on the ambiguity, right? So you do something like, that's implicit. For example, if you don't know tomorrow, will my friend show up or not? You have this implicit model in your subconscious that says, yeah, probably 90% my friend is going to show up. Therefore, I should be on time to be polite, right? And basically the takeaway here is make sure that you give your customers numbers, and you can fix uncertainty with numbers, because it will be much better for them to work with, because under ambiguity, people tend to show much stronger aversion to what you say. This is also why, for example, talking a lot about tech details and complicated systems and acronyms is really bad in a pitch, because they don't understand what you're saying. And then you create ambiguity, and people are averse to ambiguity, right? Whereas if you keep it very clear to what you're saying and they understand what you say, uncertainty is reduced, and therefore they will trust you more. And yeah, this is these attitudes towards risks. Again, it's not as easy as you would hope it is. There's differences based on expertise, of course. The more you know about something, the less you have uncertainty, or at least you believe to have less uncertainty. Age and gender have an influence, and different personality factors, again, like the big five I presented before. Growth mindsets, sensation seeking. But if you would like to know more about this, please put a coffee chat in my calendar. I will gladly talk about these topics for like 5 hours. But for the sake of time, we have to hurry on from this personality topic. So bringing me to something I've been working on a lot, decision frames. Decision frames basically is the idea that prediction errors, right? We have our world models. We have the input from our from another person, right? Or from other objects. And basically, decision frame is the idea that the way we get information from other people is usually through communication. So decision frames is the way that you phrase a certain information. And the idea behind this is that based on how you phrase it, the prediction error of people is different. So very famous prospect theory from Kahneman and Tversky, which amongst many other things found that losses loom larger than gains in the brain, right? So losing something, not losing something, is fundamentally more important for people than gaining something. So if it's about okay, either I can avoid losing 20 Swiss francs, or maybe I will not gain 20 Swiss francs, that's fundamentally different, right? In both cases, you have 20 less than you expected. But in one, you lose something. In one, you don't gain something. And the way you phrase this in language is also very impactful because it changes people's risk behavior. If they can avoid losses, people become more risk-seeking. If it's about not gaining gains, they're more risk avoidance. Very interesting fact. Works for around 70% of the population, so including most people probably in this call today. And also very interesting, there was the research group I was working with in Oxford. We found that there's also a different type of whether you communicate uncertainty based in the impact. So we don't know what will happen, but in scenario A, we will have this impact, and B, this impact, versus yes or no uncertainty. Like you just say, oh yeah, we don't know if this or for example, if you talk about climate change, if you just say, yeah, we don't know if climate change is going to mess up the world by 2030, yes or no, right? Then that's not very impactful. People don't really care. But if you tell them, okay, in scenario A, nothing happens, we waste this much money. Okay, there was in scenario B, we didn't waste the money. We have this and this much damage, which will lead to this and this long-term implications, right? This makes people think. So really talk about impact and not about yes or no things. And taking this together, which is this framing effects paper that I'm hopefully going to publish this year, it's basically the most impactful framing that you can have is one that avoids losing, one that avoids loss, and is focused on impact. So a loss-related, impact-related framing is the most powerful when you talk to customers. So you should show them not where they are good and where they could be better, but you should really show them, hey, look, this is you, this is the competition, you're losing, right? We have the solution for you, how to change the losing in a victory, and this will have this and this and this impact, right? And give them numbers. Then you have mastered the uncertainty. So we're almost done. What an impressive multi-layered evolution-shaped statistical problem-solving machine our brain is. I hope you all can say this sentence like 20 times later on before you go to sleep. Basically, one last very important thing is you all know Freud, I guess, and his idea of the conscious and the subconscious. So just very interestingly, in recent years, we have moved away from this and we more moved towards system 1 and system 2. Kahneman is the big guy behind this, Daniel Kahneman. And basically system 1 is basically in the lower sides of your brain. That's all system 1, and the top part here is system 2. System 1 just gives you emotional, instinctive, automatic, unreflected inputs, and system 2 is working with those inputs to make decisions. So that really nicely shows how 96% of our brain is automatic, subconscious inputs that are shot in our consciousness, which then has to work with those, right? And depending on the situation and personality, again, we are less or more likely to actually care about filtering the stuff that comes to our brain or just going with it, right? And this leads me to the last topic, which is cognitive biases. So cognitive biases, they arise because we have these evolution-shaped, very ancient brains that shoot inputs in our brains, right, in our consciousness, and then we need to modulate them. We need to consciously focus on pushing them back, right? And it's effortful, and people don't like effort, so they usually just don't do it, right? And that's we all. People is always we all. Don't forget that. And that's how cognitive biases arise, right? And biases are not necessarily bad by themselves. They're just something our brain learned over millions of years to fix problems. But they might be models of the world that worked back in the times, but don't work in the current day. And here, just very quickly, 5 biases for you to take away. There's I think 80 by now, or 120. Again, coffee chat, and I will talk gladly about all of them. Anchoring. So if someone is completely uncertain about how a distribution looks like, for example, and you just give them a random number, right? Then what they say, they will use this number as an anchor, and will then approximate this anchor more than if you just ask them out of the blue, what do you think is X, Y? What does this mean, especially for sales? You should pitch the budget. You should have a number. Give them a number. Give them an anchor that they can work with. And then if they don't like this anchor, they will move away from it, but they will still be closer to your anchor than if you didn't do this pitch. So be ambitious, be courageous in your pitching. Of course, still think about trust, like don't do crazy pitches. But if you have the choice between two numbers and one is a bit more competitive and higher, pick this one, because anchoring will be on your side. Availability heuristic is what I said, a familiarity. What people often see, they suddenly like more and they will remember better. So very important that sometimes maybe your customer is really fixed on a certain topic because they read it in a newspaper, because they heard it in different meetings. Maybe the meeting they had exactly before your meeting, they talked about a certain topic, and suddenly this topic takes up all of their mind. Whereas if we were rational beings, we would realize, hey, no, this is a totally different context, right? And that's maybe also important for you to realize if you yourself or your customer does this, to really separate and say, okay, but look, these are the numbers, and I think this approach is better than this approach. Hurrying up a bit, confirmation bias, the tendency we all have to like more what supports our models than what challenges them. So we all usually, except for very rare cases, we all like data more that actually confirms what we believe about the world, and less data that makes us think and challenge ourselves and question our values. The same when you talk to your customers, they probably have a mindset. Be empathetic, try to understand their world model, try to understand what they already believe, and try to match it as closely to them as possible. But again, challenge them when you have to. Sunk cost bias is the idea that if you already invest in something a lot and it's not going well, you still want to invest more because you don't want to lose, again, prospect theory, you don't want to lose what you already invested. That's also very important. Maybe if someone already invests a lot in a shopping solution and maybe YouTube would do better for them, right? Then bring them away from this bias and show them that making a cut and starting something new is the way to go. And lastly, loss aversion. We talked about this. People really hate losing something. So we can work with that as well. Key takeaways, and then we're done. And looking at the time, I'm really proud that I made it. So key takeaways, where applicable, I say this because we have people from Scaled here with so many customers that you don't really have time to really go in depth with each and every one of them. But where applicable, really spend the time to understand the personality, expectations, and needs of your customers and shape your pitch and interaction accordingly. It really pays off because people are not machines. People are very complex beings, and the better you match yourself to what they expect, the better their relationship will develop. Be aware of the importance of social trust. So go in the pitches positively, smiling and happy, but keep in the back of your mind their perspective, that they may not trust you, that they may have doubts, that they may have uncertainty about you, right? And really be aware of this and work with this. And be aware of the signals you are sending. Maybe if you sit there with a tank top, right, it sends a different signal than if you sit there with a proper shirt, right? But this is just clothing. This is like basic. But really more importantly, let's say you do a data analysis and there's like one graph which might be wrong, right? Even if all the other data in your pitch is excellently perfect, this one signal you sent with the wrong data will make them doubt you, right? So really be aware of these trust dynamics. Again, be mindful of communication and decision frames and how they impact how your customer understands what you're saying. So loss versus gaining, and there's impact versus yes and no. And there's a lot of other decision frames, of course. Again, coffee chat if you have any questions. And gonna have a caffeine overdose at this point. And lastly, be cautious about identifying irrational thought patterns and biases within our customers, but also within ourselves, but also be cautious about addressing them, because people really feel offended if you tell them they're biased or irrational. So there has to be you have to be really, really, even if you don't say it explicitly, right? You have to be really careful with realizing that they have this bias and guiding the communication in a way that avoids the bias without the person feeling hurt in their ego. That was a very quick run through the science of decision making and psychology in sales.